The first episode of Surviving Earth is officially out, and of course, we are going to talk about it. This episode is known as When the Earth Burned, and it takes place at the end of the Permian. Of course, what's being highlighted here is essentially the Great Dying, one of Earth's most devastating mass extinctions. It's the event that saw the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic period. Now, we get to view this mainly from the eyes of a Gorgonopsian family. Of course, these guys are Inostrancavia, which is one of my favorite extinct animals, period, and holy cow, their designs are just incredible. Like, look at these guys. There's just so much attention to detail here. First of all, I love the texturing of the skin. It looks very realistic. The CGI in general just looks really good. Like, there's a lot of shots that fully convinced me that we were looking at actual animals that were just existing in the wild. I also love the scarring that you can see on a lot of these individuals. Like, we are following this lead male for a good portion of the episode who just has scarring all over his face and body, which indicates that, of course, he's been through a lot throughout his life. And that kind of links into their speculative behavior for these Inostrancavia. They're portrayed as like very social animals in the fact that they're kind of like living in a group, like a family group. There are some baby Inostrancavias and I believe a few females. And of course, you have this lead male right here. I think structurally they're trying to make it seem a little bit more like a lion pride of today, which is something that kind of hints to the fact that Inostrancavia and other Gorgonopsians are more closely related to mammals than they are to reptiles, for example. They are therapsids, and they belong to the group that's known as Synapsida, which is a group that, again, makes them far more closely related to us. They're not true mammals themselves, they're more so the precursors to mammals. They're a part of the group that eventually saw the rise of mammals, but they're just not quite mammals themselves. The behavior was certainly really interesting. Per my knowledge, I don't know if we've ever seen Inostrancavia portrayed in this way, and it was really cool to see. It was actually just really fantastic to get so much time to spend with Inostrancavia, because that doesn't happen a lot either. A lot of times you get just like a quick moment with Inostrancavia where it just does a hunt or something, or it's getting into a fight, and then that's the extent of it. Here we get to see a glimpse of some speculative, social behaviors, or just like speculative behaviors in general, and you get to see them doing like relatively mundane day-to-day things. I just absolutely loved it, and I really loved their animations. I think that's something that really complemented what they were going for with this Gorgonopsian family. Like, there was an animation of one yawning. I loved that. I don't know. It was just a simple thing. I think the reason why I loved it so much is because at that point they were talking about the long sabers that Inostrancavia has. And so to show off the sabers, they just had him yawn. And I thought that was a great way to showcase something like that. Now, obviously, these Gorgonopsians are not the only creatures that we see. There is a herd of Scutosaurus, which isn't also incredible to see, with such an amazing design too. Everything looks fantastic here. They're really huge and rounded and bulky, just like how the fossils suggest, and they are absolutely covered in osteoderms, which are the bones that grow in the skin. Scutosaurus was absolutely covered in that. Now, for a little bit, we are following a baby Inostrancavia as it gets a little bit too curious and it starts chasing after an elf, which is this little therapsid right here. At first, I thought that it was a Diictodon in the trailers, but of course, I am incorrect on that. I really like the way that it looks, though. The CGI looks amazing, and I really like the design. Nice colors, too. But it starts chasing this little fella directly into the Scutosaurus herd, and from that point on, it gets a little bit more curious, and eventually some weather circumstances cause the herd to stampede, thereby potentially threatening the life of this little baby Inostrancavia. And at that point, the mother tries to save her son, essentially, and it leads to this really nicely done moment of the mother trying to run through the herd, very similar to Mufasa from The Lion King, as she tries to, of course, save her son, and in the process, as she gets on top of him to protect him, she gets crushed by a Scutosaurus, and it was incredibly sad. And that was very early on in the episode. It was certainly a really interesting introduction to these animals, I guess. But yeah, it was incredibly sad. Now, again, the main point of this episode in large part is to showcase the way that animals are reacting to mass extinctions. So over the course of this episode, you're gradually seeing more and more things that hint at the fact that there is a huge mass extinction going on. You see acid rain, you see earthquakes, and eventually you see volcanic activity. The temperature is starting to rise, and as a result, these Gorgonopsians are trying to move to cooler locations so that they, can beat the heat, so to speak. And that's something that's leading to very difficult situations. Even the Scutosaurus herd is having a tough time as the climate gets hotter. It's getting harder and harder for them to find ways to cool off. They're desperately clinging on to any piece of shade they possibly can. It's really quite sad to see, but I loved how they showed that it was a little bit more of a gradual process instead of like an instantaneous mass extinction. They just show little hints of things that are happening that eventually saw the extinction of a lot of animals on Earth. Oh, and there's also Suminia. I was not expecting to see Suminia, but it was such a treat to see it. Suminia is this little fella right here. It's a type of creature that I always kind of thought was a little bit creepy, but the only reason why I thought that is because of this image right here. This is like nightmare inducing. Like, look at that. But it's a little synapsid that was most likely arboreal, meaning it spent a lot of its time in the trees as they were portrayed in this episode. And oh gosh, man, just their design looked incredible. The quality of the CGI looked incredible. And those colors, golly, those colors were certainly a sight to see. I think this is like one of the first times we've ever seen Suminia on screen, which was just a real treat. So I loved that portion. But yeah, as I mentioned, we get closer and closer to like the peak of the mass extinction. Eventually, volcanic activity starts to occur, which is then extremely devastating for life on Earth. While this is occurring, the lead male Gorgonopsian that we see for the majority of the episode is confronted by like a younger male who wants to challenge for the right to this group, essentially. And it leads to this really epic showdown between the two of them. Now, the fight was so fast, so visceral. It was incredibly brutal. It felt like a decently realistic animal fight in that way. The sounds were really good. I loved every minute of that. Hello, Future Dino Guy here. I just wanted to come in here and add a little section to state that this is an episode of television, which means that it's structured like an episode of television. What I mean by that is that there are commercial breaks. We're living in a world where most things are made with streaming in mind, where you don't have to, adhere to those commercial breaks that kind of like have to be sprinkled throughout the episode. They could just play the story from start to end. And of course, sometimes there's ads that play if you're paying for like a cheaper version or something like that. But the episodes are not structured in a way that like accommodates for those ad breaks. Surviving Earth does accommodate for ad breaks because it airs on NBC Thursday nights, and then, it airs on Peacock the next day. Now, I don't know if there's like a different version that airs on Peacock because I have yet to watch it, but at the very least, the version I watched would be like gearing up to get into a very dramatic moment, like say the Gorgonopsians fighting, and then like before they get into the real meat and potatoes of the fight, it cuts to commercial break, right? And then it comes back, and then what they do is basically do a little bit of a recap, just in case there's like anybody who's now just joining, so that they understand where we are in that point in the story. So they kind of like reestablish the fact that there's two Gorgonopsians about to fight each other, and then they get into the fight. And that probably does mess with the pacing a little bit. Obviously, it's not the fault of the filmmakers. That's just what has to happen when it airs on actual TV. So just a little bit of a warning for that. It's obviously it's not a big deal or anything. It doesn't really take away from Surviving Earth. It's just something that I wanted to provide as a little bit of a warning. Again, I don't know if it's different on Peacock. It could very well be different on there. And if it is different, just ignore everything I just said. All right, let's just get back in the video. Now, and then we get a little section that is dedicated to highlighting that, yeah, this was a bad mass extinction. A huge percentage of life on Earth, around 90% or so, went extinct at this point in Earth's history. And not many animals survived. Like the diversity of all of the animals on Earth kind of like was brought down quite a few pegs at that point. They do highlight that a relative of Elf did survive, and was able to continue on into the Triassic period, essentially. And that's true for pretty much any lineage that is alive today. Every single, lineage that you see today has a distant ancestor that survived the Great Dying, obviously, because otherwise there would be nothing here. It highlighted some of the vegetation that survived and was able to help the Earth recover, and it was a fairly good sequence. It wasn't too dramatic, all things considered. It just kind of presented it as this was an extinction. Extinctions are a natural part of Earth's history. They have occurred quite a few times throughout Earth's history, as we're going to see with this documentary series. And it was presenting it as that. It shows the tragedy of it all, but it also shows that life prevailed after the fact. And that is certainly emphasized when we get into the Triassic portion. Now, it's fairly small. It takes place about 10 million years after when we saw the Gorgonopsian family and everything. And while that section really highlighted therapsids, the synapsids, the mammal relatives, this portion of the episode highlights the reptiles. Now, one highlight for me was this fella right here, Dongasuchus. It is an early Archosauriform, which I thought was really neat. I've never heard of this fella before. And might I say, I just love the way that it looks. You're probably going to be hearing that a lot from, my reviews of these episodes. But the reason why is because so many amazing paleo artists design these creatures. The Gorgonopsians, for example, were designed by Gabriel Ugueto, a fantastic paleo artist. And he's not the only one. There's so many other paleo artists who are attached to this project. So a lot of the creature designs are certainly going to stand out. I'm already calling it. There's Dongasuchus, and they gave it feathers, which I thought was a really cool detail. As time goes on, with more discoveries we make, the more likely it seems that the last common ancestor of Dinosauria, or Archosauria in general, might have had some type of feathers, because we basically see feathers in pterosaurs, for example, and we see feathers in dinosaurs. Now, those two are very closely related, but that implies that a common ancestor of, at the very least, those two lineages had some type of feathering. And I liked that it was really kind of shown right here. Now, the Dongasuchus does exhibit sexual dimorphism. The females have a different color from the males. The male looks really cool, so vibrant, definitely not a dull coloration. It's really eye-catching, and I loved it. We get to see it do a little bit of a mating dance as well before it gets attacked by a Symbospondylus, which is a huge ichthyosaur that I recently learned about, and I love it. It's like a very stretched out ichthyosaur. It has really weird proportions, and it's amazing. On top of that, there was also mention of a proto-pterosaur, and they're gliding pterosaurs. Now, when I first heard it, I didn't really have any knowledge about it. But to be fair, I don't really know a lot about early pterosaur evolution. But also, to be fair, it seems like no one really has much of an understanding of early pterosaur evolution. We don't have a lot of examples of early pterosaurs. There are a few here and there that are likely early, ancestors to pterosaurs that did not fly, they did not glide or anything like that, but they were likely the precursor to pterosaurs. This guy right here is like a speculative middle ground by the looks of it. One that's on its way to powered flight, but instead of powered flight, it glides. Now, this is not a new idea. In this book right here, called Pterosaurs by Mark Whitten, it's mentioned that this so-called proto-pterosaur has been speculated before as a possible precursor to the more derived pterosaurs that we're more familiar with. This was most notably speculated by Rupert Wilde, who proposed that early pterosaurs were likely more so gliders as opposed to animals that were more suited for powered flight. It was like a transition from animals that did not fly at all and eventually made their way to powered flight, the type of flying that we're familiar with pterosaurs. We don't really have evidence for it. Per my knowledge, this is still completely speculative because we don't have any fossil evidence of gliding pterosaurs. So the gliding pterosaurs, proto-pterosaurs actually, that you see in surviving Earth are likely speculative, something that likely prepares us for the introduction of pterosaurs that I assume we're going to see later. I'm trying to think in the trailer. Yeah, we did. Yeah, I remember seeing a pterosaur in the trailer. So yeah, that was basically what I was able to piece together. They certainly had a very interesting design, and I think that it's really cool that they included something like that. Now, if you know a little bit more about early pterosaur evolution and you're able to add something to it, be sure to let me know in the comments. That's just simply what I was able to find. Then finally, the end of the episode cuts to the modern day, where they highlight climate change, emphasizing the fact that, of course, we are going through that very thing right now, and a lot of animals are going extinct. This is probably going to be a big goal from this documentary, is to highlight extinction level events that Earth's past has gone through and emphasize that we're seeing something similar today. Because, of course, the amount of CO2 that we are pumping into the atmosphere is changing the climate at a very quick rate. So quick that many animals are not able to adapt quick enough, and as a result, a lot of them are going extinct. That is something that is very much happening. I know that some people are likely going to watch the documentary and they're going to get angry at that inclusion, but it's certainly something that needs to be brought up, and I'm so glad that they did. So that was episode 1 of Surviving Earth. A fantastic start, if you ask me. There was a lot of really cool highlights in this documentary. I thought that it told a pretty solid story, and it was great. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the series. Of course, we have 7 episodes remaining with a lot of creatures that have yet to make an appearance, as well as a lot of huge Earth events that occurred throughout the history of time, I guess. We have a lot to cover in the remainder weeks. If you don't know, of course, this is releasing weekly, every Thursday on NBC, and then the next day on Peacock. But I do hope you guys enjoyed both the episode and my video on the episode. But that's pretty much all I have for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and have an awesome day.